So now we're moving on to the dog story. A few months ago, I had a message to call Bill, who's a director of a company based in Telford. He'd found our name off the internet, and I was told he was very stressed and not easy to understand over the telephone. So I called Bill back, and for what I understood, Bill's biggest concern was that he was being pressed by his bank for repayment of a personal loan of around £25,000. He also mentioned his company, which was a guarding company. That's one of those companies that provide security personnel to clients' premises for a contractual number of hours, typically overnight. There were debts to the company that couldn't be paid. I asked Bill if he could get to my office to have a meeting. Bill explained that he couldn't drive since his accident. So I thought for a moment and said, OK, let me have your home address and I'll come and see you. So we organised a time and a date, and as I was winding up the conversation, this could well be a wasted trip, Bill interrupted. "Are you OK with dogs?" he asked. "I've got a couple of pups." Well, I didn't give too much thought to Bill's final question until I stood outside his house a few days later, having just knocked. "Just a minute," I could hear Bill shouting in between menacing dog barks. It reminded me of those police dogs at away football matches, baying for blood, but at least the police dogs were on leads. Eventually the door opened and Bill appeared. He was around 60, grey-haired and tall. He explained he'd just shut his pups in the sitting room, and so long as I wasn't nervous about dogs, I'd be fine. Bill introduced me to his pups, and as I'd guessed by now, far from being a couple of cute little puppy dogs, Bill had a couple of big ugly brutes. They were a 10-month-old German Shepherd called Zeus and a 2-year-old Doberman called Tyson. And between them, I guess they weighed in at about 200 pounds, around 7 or 8 stones apiece. And here they are. That's Zeus. And if you think he's ugly, this is Tyson. Wow, he's even uglier. So without being asked, Bill proceeded to put on some protective clothing and demonstrated to me, in his kitchen, how the dogs would treat an intruder. I made the quick mental note. If ever I decided to become a burglar, I'd give Bill's house a miss. Bill left me to get to know Zeus and Tyson while he made some coffees. I sat on the settee in Bill's living room and the dogs joined me there, intrigued to see what I'd got in my pockets and briefcase, or whether I was going to make a break for it and play the intruder game, which was so much fun. Bill carried on talking. He explained he'd had an accident around 2 years ago when a horse trod on his head. I'm not quite sure how he managed to get his head under a horse's hoof. It sounded a bit careless to me. It certainly didn't sound very pleasant. His cheekbone and face had been completely smashed, and he'd been in intensive care for a week. And Bill's face had taken months of surgery to reconstruct. He'd also become muddled and forgetful since the accident, which caused real difficulties to keep his business under control. By the time Bill had explained all this, Zeus and Tyson had got to know me quite well. They were both sitting on either side of me, trying to get as close as possible. Bill had given me some bits of sausage to feed to the dogs, which only really made them more excited. I hope they can spot the difference between a finger and a sausage, I thought. Note-taking wasn't easy, and it went through my mind that by the end of the meeting, me and the dogs would need a bit of surgery ourselves to be separated. Bill carried on explaining about his company. He had 2 employees and 3 contracts. The company was in arrears with its PAYE and falling further behind. The company records were a mess, and Bill really hadn't got a clue about how profitable the contracts were. But Bill's biggest concern were the threatening letters he was receiving from his bank about the personal loan of £25,000 that he'd taken out to finance the business a couple of years ago and that had now fallen into arrears. So, cut a long story short, Bill's finances were like this. He'd transferred his interest in the jointly owned property to his wife about 3 years ago, without consideration. If a trustee in bankruptcy was appointed, this is a transaction that could have been challenged. He'd little other income outside of the company. Including the bank loan, his personal creditors were around £35,000. His wife was spending much time away from Bill. She said she didn't want to be with him in his present state. There's a small amount of money available through family sources. So he wrote to the bank and explained the full position. And after a couple of letters, the bank agreed to settle on a full and final settlement of £3,000. Bill couldn't believe it. I had to show him the letter from the bank and go through it with him, word by word, to convince him. His brother provided the funds, and that at least dealt with the personal debt. So that left the company. Bill was now mostly concerned about his staff and keeping them with jobs. And here's a summary of the company position. So the PAYE arrears were around £25,000. There were other creditors of £10,000, potential employee liabilities of £20,000. The 3 contracts were worth £10,000, debtor monies of around £12,000, and Bill didn't want to continue, but he couldn't anyway. He clearly just couldn't physically continue. So it was clear the company had to go into liquidation. There was no way the company could survive. But ideally, what we wanted to do was preserve the business, the employments and the contracts, which was easier said than done. Fortunately, we know a lot of local businesses, so we spoke to a couple of guarding companies who were both interested in buying the contracts and taking on the staff. And we managed to secure this deal, which is up there already. So we need to go back on that. So the deal we managed to secure was £10,000 for the consideration of the business. The acquiring company took over the contracts on an agreed date, so there was continuity of the service and no disruption. The employees were retained, all of their employee rights were transferred under 2P, and that meant there were no employee liabilities remaining in the company. The client companies themselves approved the transfer, and all of the debtor monies due under the contract were paid, around £12,000. And Bill's old company went into liquidation, which meant that all the company liabilities died with it, together with the nightmare of bringing all the accounting records up to date. I told Bill about the need for a formal creditors meeting, and we discussed where this would be. Usually we hold these at our office in Walsall, but to suit Bill, we eventually agreed to have it at his home in Telford. Unfortunately, no creditors attended, which is just as well, because Zeus and Tyson were there, sitting on the settee, which I think would have discouraged any prolonged questioning. About a month later, I popped in to see Bill. Zeus and Tyson were pleased to see me, and Bill was slowly coming to terms with retirement. Bill's wife had moved back home, and his employees had settled down in their new jobs. Bill seemed much more relaxed, and I felt pleased about the part we'd played.